A small-town waitress served coffee with a smile for 15 years, never revealing the deadly skills that could kill a man in 3 seconds. When Navy SEALs stormed her diner at dawn, the whole town discovered that Rosalie Hendricks was not who she claimed to be. This is the story of how one woman's carefully buried past collided with her quiet present in the most unexpected way possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rosalie had perfected the art of invisibility. In the sleepy mountain town of Cedar Falls, Montana, population 847, she was just another face behind the counter of Millie's diner, a woman who poured coffee, remembered how customers liked their eggs, and never caused trouble. She wore her auburn hair in a simple ponytail, kept her makeup minimal, and spoke with the soft drawl she'd cultivated over the years to blend in with the locals. To everyone who knew her, she was simply Rosie, the friendly waitress who'd moved to town after a bad divorce and needed a fresh start. But beneath that carefully constructed exterior lay secrets that could shatter the peaceful facade of Cedar Falls forever. For 15 years, Rosalie had lived this double life with military precision. She woke at 4:30 a.m. every morning, not because the diner opened early, but because old habits from a previous life died hard. While the town slept, she would run exactly 5 miles through the winding mountain trails, her pace never varying, her breathing controlled and silent. The locals who occasionally spotted her jogging assumed she was just trying to stay in shape. They had no idea they were watching a former operative maintain the physical conditioning that had once made her one of the most feared assassins in the world. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now spent her days serving pie and coffee to retired veterans who had no clue they were being waited on by someone who had once operated in the shadows of international espionage. Cedar Falls was filled with former military personnel who'd chosen the quiet mountain town for their retirement. Men who'd served in Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan. They treated her like a daughter, leaving generous tips and asking about her day with genuine concern. If any of them had known that the woman refilling their coffee cups had once eliminated high-value targets across 3 continents, their peaceful breakfast conversations might have taken a very different turn. Rosalie had chosen Cedar Falls, specifically because it was the kind of place where people minded their own business and respected privacy. Nestled in a valley between towering peaks, accessible only by one winding mountain road, it was the perfect place to disappear. The town had one main street, lined with weathered wooden buildings that housed the essentials: a general store, a post office, a gas station, and Millie's diner. Most residents had lived there for generations, their families tied to the now-defunct copper mine that had once sustained the community. They were hard-working people who valued loyalty and trust above all else. Exactly the kind of community where a woman with a fabricated identity could build a new life. She had assumed the identity of Rosalie Hendricks with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her former profession. The real Rosalie Hendricks had died in a car accident in Denver 15 years ago, a woman with no family, no close friends, and a background that could be easily modified. The woman now living under that name had spent months studying her target's life, perfecting her mannerisms and creating a believable backstory that would satisfy casual questioning but never invite deeper investigation. The diner itself had become her perfect cover. Millie's was a local institution, having served the same hearty breakfast fare for over 30 years. When the original owner, Millie Thompson, decided to retire, Rosalie had appeared with just enough money to buy the business and a story about wanting to start over after her marriage fell apart. The locals had embraced her warmly, grateful that their beloved gathering place would remain open. They had no way of knowing that the money she'd used to purchase the diner came from numbered accounts in 3 different countries, or that her failed marriage was actually a cover story for her extraction from a black ops program that officially didn't exist. Every morning, as she unlocked the diner's front door and flipped the handwritten "open" sign, Rosalie marveled at how successfully she had buried her past. The woman who had once moved through international capitals with deadly efficiency now worried about whether they had enough fresh eggs for the morning rush and if old Pete Morrison would want his usual stack of pancakes. She had traded her arsenal of weapons for coffee pots and spatulas, her encrypted communications for small-town gossip, and her adrenaline-fueled missions for the simple satisfaction of a job well done in an honest profession. But as any operative knows, the past is a way of finding you when you least expect it. No matter how carefully you construct your new identity, no matter how thoroughly you believe you've severed all connections to your former life, there are always threads that can be pulled, always traces that can be followed by someone with the right resources and determination. On this particular morning, as Rosalie went through her usual routine of preparing the diner for another ordinary day in Cedar Falls, she had no idea that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. She didn't know that satellite surveillance had finally identified her location, or that a team of Navy SEALs was already en route to the small mountain town. She couldn't have imagined that within hours, her quiet life as a small-town waitress would be over, and the deadly skills she had worked so hard to bury would be called upon once again. The truth was about to surface, and Cedar Falls would never be the same. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The alarm clock beside Rosalie's bed buzzed at exactly 4:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 15 years. She silenced it with a practiced motion, her hand moving with the swift precision of someone who had trained herself never to be groggy upon waking. In her former life, being slow to consciousness could mean the difference between life and death. Old habits she had learned were nearly impossible to break. Her small apartment above the diner was spartanly furnished but comfortable. A single bed with military crisp sheets, a modest dresser, and a reading chair by the window that overlooked Main Street. To any visitor, it would appear to be the humble living space of a hard-working woman making an honest living. What they wouldn't notice were the subtle modifications, the reinforced doorframe, the specially installed locks, or the small mirror positioned to give her a clear view of anyone approaching the building from 3 different angles. Rosalie padded to the kitchen in bare feet, her movements naturally silent despite the old wooden floors that creaked under most people's weight. She had learned to distribute her weight in a way that minimized sound, a skill that proved surprisingly useful in an old building where every footstep could wake the neighbors. She filled her coffee maker with the same measured precision she brought to everything else, then began her morning stretching routine while waiting for it to brew. The stretches looked innocent enough, basic yoga poses and flexibility exercises that any health-conscious woman might do. But each movement served to maintain the muscle memory and flexibility that had once allowed her to slip through ventilation systems, scale buildings, and strike with lethal accuracy. She held each position for exactly 30 seconds, her breathing controlled and rhythmic, her mind clear and focused. As the coffee finished brewing, the first hints of dawn began to paint the sky outside her window a soft purple-gray. Cedar Falls was at its most beautiful in these quiet morning hours, when mist clung to the mountains and the town lay peaceful and still. She poured herself a single cup of black coffee and stood at the window, watching the empty street below. This was her favorite time of day. The calm before the gentle chaos of small-town life began. In exactly 20 minutes. She would see Harold Brennan's pickup truck rumble down Main Street as he headed to check on his cattle. 5 minutes after that, young Tommy Valdez would jog past on his morning run, training for the state cross-country championships. At 5:45, the newspaper delivery truck would make its rounds, followed by the mail carrier's early prep work. Rosalie knew the patterns of everyone in town, Not from any professional paranoia, but because these routines had become the comforting rhythm of her new life. She finished her coffee and changed into her running clothes, practical black leggings, a faded gray t-shirt, and well-worn trail running shoes. The outfit looked unremarkable, but like everything else in her life, it served multiple purposes. The shoes had reinforced soles suitable for any terrain. The clothing was designed for silent movement, and everything was in neutral colors that would blend into the mountain landscape. Stepping out into the crisp mountain air, Rosalie began her daily 5-mile run through the trails that wound up into the foothills behind Cedar Falls. To anyone who might see her, she was just a health-conscious woman maintaining her fitness routine. They had no idea they were watching someone conduct a daily reconnaissance of every approach to the town, memorizing sight lines, identifying potential defensive positions, and staying intimately familiar with the terrain that could become crucial. If her past ever caught up with her, the trail was steep and challenging, winding through dense stands of pine and aspen that filtered the early morning light into dancing patterns on the forest floor. Rosalie's pace never varied, a steady, sustainable rhythm that could be maintained for much longer distances if necessary. Her breathing remained controlled, her footfalls nearly silent on the needle-covered path. These mountains had become her sanctuary, but she had never allowed herself to forget that they might one day need to serve as her escape route. As she ran, her mind went through the same mental checklist it had performed every morning for 15 years. Exit strategies from the town, the main road, 2 hiking trails that led over the mountain passes, and the old mining road that was barely passable, but would take her to the highway 20 miles south. Emergency supplies, cached at 3 different locations in the mountains, each containing enough food, water, and equipment to survive for 2 weeks. Contact protocols, a single emergency number memorized but never used, leading to people who could provide new identities and safe passage if her cover was ever blown. But as the years had passed peacefully in Cedar Falls, these mental exercises had become more routine than urgent. The constant vigilance that had once been a matter of survival had gradually softened into simple habit. Rosalie had begun to believe that she had truly escaped her past, that the woman she had once been was buried so deeply that she would never surface again. Returning from her run as the sun fully crested the mountains, Rosalie felt the familiar sense of satisfaction that came from maintaining her physical conditioning. She showered quickly, dressed in her work uniform, a simple blue dress and comfortable shoes, and tied her hair back in the practical ponytail that had become her signature. Looking in the mirror, she saw exactly what she wanted the world to see, a pleasant, unremarkable woman in her early 40s who worked hard, minded her own business, and had carved out a quiet life in a peaceful mountain town. At exactly 6 o'clock a.m., she unlocked the front door of Millie's diner and flipped the hand-painted wooden sign from closed to open. The familiar routine of preparing for another day began, starting the coffee, heating the griddle, checking that everything was stocked and ready for the morning rush that would begin in earnest when the first regulars arrived at 6:30. As she went through these comforting, ordinary tasks, Rosalie had no way of knowing that this would be the last normal morning of her carefully constructed life. She couldn't have imagined that even as she arranged the sugar dispensers and filled the napkin holders, a team of Navy SEALs was already closing in on Cedar Falls, following a trail that had taken them 3 years to uncover. The quiet life she had built was about to end, and the deadly skills she had worked so hard to forget were about to become the only thing standing between her and a fate she had spent 15 years trying to avoid. The morning sun cast long golden shadows across Main Street as Cedar Falls awakened to another peaceful Tuesday. The air carried the crisp bite of mountain autumn, scented with pine needles and the faint smoke from chimneys where early risers had lit their first fires of the season. Frost still clung to the edges of windows and the metal surfaces of parked trucks, creating delicate crystalline patterns that would vanish within the hour. Millie's diner occupied the corner of Main and Pine Streets. Its weathered brick facade, painted a cheerful yellow that had faded to a warm cream over the years. Red and white checkered curtains framed the large front windows, and a hand-carved wooden sign swayed gently in the morning breeze. The building itself dated back to the 1940s, when Cedar Falls had been a thriving mining town, and its thick walls and solid construction spoke to an era when things were built to last forever. Inside, the diner was a masterpiece of small-town Americana. The floor was laid with black and white checkered linoleum that had been buffed to a comfortable shine by decades of foot traffic. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, their high backs creating intimate spaces where locals could conduct their morning conversations in relative privacy. Each booth had its own small jukebox selector, though most of the songs dated back to the 1960s and 70s. The countertop ran along the left side of the restaurant, backed by a mirror that reflected the orderly rows of coffee cups, pie plates, and the vintage cash register that still rang with satisfying mechanical precision. The walls were decorated with a carefully curated collection of local history. Black and white photographs showed Cedar Falls in its mining heyday, when the population had swelled to over 3,000 and the streets bustled with activity around the clock. Faded newspaper clippings chronicled high school football victories, the closing of the mine, and the gradual transformation of the town into a quiet retirement haven. A large topographical map dominated one wall, marking the hiking trails and fishing spots that drew the occasional tourist during the summer months. Behind the counter, the kitchen was visible through a wide pass-through window. The griddle was seasoned to perfection from years of use, and the coffee maker was a massive commercial model that could brew enough coffee to fuel the entire town's morning caffeine needs. Everything was spotlessly clean and meticulously organized, from the neat rows of spices to the precisely arranged cooking utensils. Hanging from magnetic strips along the wall, the morning light streaming through the front windows illuminated every detail with startling clarity. Dust motes danced in the golden beams, and the polished chrome fixtures reflected the light in cheerful sparkles throughout the room. The air was thick with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee, mingling with the promise of bacon and eggs that would soon be sizzling on the griddle. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move more slowly, where conversations could unfold without urgency, and where strangers quickly became friends. As the town began to stir to life, the familiar symphony of Cedar Falls mornings filled the air. The distant rumble of Harold Brennan's pickup truck echoed off the surrounding mountains as he made his way to the pastures. The rhythmic thudding of Tommy Valdez's morning run created a steady percussion on the sidewalk outside. From somewhere down the street came the metallic clang of Frank Kowalski opening his auto repair shop, followed by the wheeze and rattle of his ancient air compressor starting up. The mountains themselves formed a dramatic backdrop to this peaceful scene. To the north, Eagle Peak rose nearly 10,000 feet, its summit already dusted with the season's first snow. The eastern slopes caught the morning sun and glowed with the brilliant gold and orange of changing aspen leaves, while the western faces remained in cool purple shadow. These mountains had stood sentinel over the valley for millions of years, witnessing the rise and fall of the mining boom, the gradual exodus of young people seeking opportunities elsewhere, and the steady influx of retirees drawn by the peace and natural beauty. The sound environment was as carefully layered as a symphony. The constant whisper of wind through the pine trees provided a gentle bass note, punctuated by the occasional call of a hawk circling high overhead. The creek that ran behind the diner added its soft gurgling voice, barely audible but somehow essential to the overall sense of tranquility. Even the man-made sounds seemed to belong. The distant hum of electrical lines, the soft whoosh of cars passing on the highway half a mile away, and the comforting domestic noises of a community beginning its daily routines. Inside the diner, every surface told a story. The counter bore the gentle indentations left by countless elbows and coffee cups, polished smooth by years of use. The booth seats had been reupholstered several times, but still showed the comfortable sag that came from hosting thousands of conversations. The coffee maker bore a small dent where someone had accidentally struck it with a spatula years ago. And the register's keys were worn smooth by decades of fingers ringing up countless meals. The lighting was warm and inviting, a combination of natural sunlight and carefully positioned fixtures that created pockets of comfortable illumination. Throughout the space, ceiling fans moved the air gently, their slow rotation creating subtle shifts in the patterns of light and shadow. Everything about the space spoke of continuity, of a place where traditions were maintained and changes came slowly and thoughtfully. Outside, the street was beginning to show signs of life. Mrs. Patterson walked her ancient basset hound past. The front windows, the dog's tail wagging at the familiar scents drifting from the diner's kitchen exhaust fan. The mail carrier's truck appeared at the far end of Main Street, beginning its methodical progress from building to building. A few early customers would arrive soon, drawn by the promise of hot coffee and warm companionship. This was Cedar Falls at its most typical, most peaceful, most perfectly ordinary. The kind of morning that had repeated itself hundreds of times before, where the biggest decision facing most residents was whether to order pancakes or eggs, and the most pressing concern was whether the weekend weather would be good enough for fishing. It was a scene of such complete normalcy that it seemed impossible anything could ever disturb its tranquil rhythm. But tranquility, as any student of history knows, is often just the calm before an unexpected storm. Rosalie moved through the diner with the fluid efficiency of someone who had memorized every inch of the space. She filled the coffee maker with exactly 48 ounces of water, enough for the morning rush, but not so much that it would sit and grow bitter. Her movements were economical, purposeful, each action flowing seamlessly into the next without wasted motion. To the casual observer, she simply looked like an experienced waitress who knew her job well. They couldn't see the muscle memory ingrained by years of training, where every gesture had once been calculated for maximum efficiency and minimum exposure. At 42, Rosalie had cultivated an appearance of comfortable invisibility. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, with a few carefully arranged strands framing her face to soften the angular features that could appear too sharp under scrutiny. She wore minimal makeup, just enough to look polished, but not so much as to draw attention. Her uniform dress was a simple blue cotton that flattered her figure without being provocative, paired with sensible white sneakers that allowed her to move silently across the diner's floors. Everything about her appearance had been carefully chosen to project the image of a hardworking, unremarkable woman who minded her own business, but beneath this ordinary exterior lay the mind of someone who had once been considered one of the most dangerous women alive. Even now, as she went through the mundane task of arranging sugar dispensers, part of her consciousness automatically cataloged details that most people would never notice. The unmarked sedan that had passed by twice in the past hour, its occupants, hidden behind tinted windows. The way the new customer at table 6 kept his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. The subtle change in the morning bird songs that suggested something had disturbed the natural rhythm of the forest behind the diner. These observations filed themselves away in her mind without conscious effort, artifacts of training so deeply embedded that she couldn't turn it off even after 15 years of trying. It was like being fluent in a deadly language that she could never forget how to speak, even though she desperately wanted to forget every word. Rosalie's internal world was a carefully constructed fortress of normalcy built around a core of lethal capability that she worked every day to keep buried. She had trained herself to think in terms of recipes and customer preferences instead of target acquisition and elimination protocols. She forced herself to worry about mundane concerns, like whether they had enough eggs for the breakfast rush, rather than calculating sightlines and escape routes. Most days, she was successful in maintaining this mental discipline. But there were moments, usually in the pre-dawn hours, when she was most alone with her thoughts, when the old habits would surface unbidden. She had been born Catherine Elena Marchetti in Detroit, the daughter of a factory worker and a school teacher who had named her after Saint Catherine of Alexandria, hoping their daughter would grow up to be both learned and strong. They couldn't have imagined how literally their prayers would be answered. Catherine had shown an aptitude for languages and strategic thinking that had caught the attention of military recruiters during her junior year at the University of Michigan. What had started as a conversation about intelligence analysis had evolved into something far more specialized and far more dangerous at the transformation from Catherine Marchetti, political science major, to Agent Nightingale of the Strategic Operations Division had taken 3 years of training that had stripped away everything soft and vulnerable about her personality and rebuilt her as a precision instrument of national security. She had learned to kill with her bare hands, to speak 7 languages without accent, to assume and maintain deep cover identities for months or years at a time. Most importantly, she had learned to bury her true self so deeply that even she sometimes forgot who she had been before the training began. For 12 years, she had operated in the shadows of international conflict. She had eliminated targets in Eastern European capitals whose names never appeared in newspapers. She had infiltrated terrorist cells, corporate espionage networks, and foreign intelligence services with equal skill. Her success rate had been perfect, her cover never blown, her real identity known only to a handful of handlers who communicated through encrypted channels and anonymous dead drops. But perfection in that world came with a price that even the most hardened operatives eventually found too high to pay. Catherine had begun to lose pieces of herself with each mission, each carefully constructed lie, each life she took in service of objectives she was never fully briefed on. The woman who had once dreamed of teaching international relations at a small college had been consumed by the agent who could assume any identity and eliminate any target. The breaking point had come during a mission in Prague, when she had been forced to maintain deep cover for 8 months as the girlfriend of an arms dealer she was ultimately ordered to eliminate. She had played the role so convincingly that the target had fallen genuinely in love with her, confiding his dreams of retiring from the arms trade and opening a small restaurant in the countryside. When the order came to terminate him, Catherine had looked into his trusting eyes and realized she couldn't remember the last time she had felt anything authentic herself. She had completed the mission. Her training was too thorough, her conditioning too complete for her to do otherwise. But as she watched the light fade from his eyes, she knew that Catherine Marchetti had died along with him. What remained was a collection of skills and reflexes, wrapped around an emptiness that grew larger with each passing day. The decision to disappear had been made in that moment, though it had taken her 6 more months to plan and execute her extraction from the program. She had used every skill they had taught her to erase Agent Nightingale from existence and create Rosalie Hendricks in her place. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had used the very capabilities that made her such an effective operative to betray the organization that had created her. Now, as she wiped down tables and checked the salt and pepper shakers, Rosalie held onto the fiction that she had successfully buried that other woman. She told herself that the Catherine who had once moved through European capitals like a ghost was gone forever, replaced by someone who cared about whether the coffee was fresh and if old Pete Morrison's arthritis was acting up again. She wanted desperately to believe that the capacity for violence had been replaced by the capacity for simple human kindness. But deep down, in the place where her truest thoughts lived, she knew better. The skills never truly disappeared. They just waited, dormant but ready, like a weapon kept in a locked drawer. She could feel them sometimes, stirring restlessly when her carefully constructed routine was disrupted or when some subtle threat triggered her ingrained paranoia. On those days, she had to work harder to maintain the gentle demeanor that had become her armor against the world, today felt different, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. There was a tension in the air that her trained senses couldn't ignore, a subtle rawness that made the space between her shoulder blades itch with familiar warning. She found herself checking the exits more frequently, her eyes lingering on the unmarked sedan that had made its third pass by the diner in the past. 2 hours, Rosalie forced herself to focus on the task at hand, arranging the last of the condiment bottles with mechanical precision. In 15 minutes, the first customers would arrive, and she would slip back into the role that had become her refuge. She would smile, pour coffee, and pretend that she was nothing more than what she appeared to be. She had no way of knowing that those 15 minutes would be the last peaceful moments of her carefully constructed life. The unmarked black SUVs appeared at exactly 6:47 a.m., their arrival shattering the morning tranquility of Cedar Falls like stones through glass. They came from 3 directions simultaneously, 2 from the main road, 1 from the old mining trail that most locals had forgotten existed. The vehicles moved with military precision, their occupants clearly familiar with coordinated tactical approaches. Rosalie spotted them through the diner's front window just as she was refilling the napkin dispensers, and every instinct she had spent 15 years trying to suppress suddenly roared to life. The lead vehicle was a matte black Suburban, with government plates that weren't quite regulation issue. Tinted windows obscured the occupants, but Rosalie could see the subtle modifications that marked it as far more than a standard government transport: reinforced bumpers, run-flat tires, and the barely visible antenna array that suggested sophisticated communications equipment. The other vehicles maintained perfect formation, their spacing calculated to provide overlapping fields of fire while preventing any target from escaping through the gaps. Her trained eye automatically cataloged details that would be invisible to civilian observers. The way the lead vehicle's front passenger maintained radio contact through a throat mic, the synchronized timing of their arrival that spoke of extensive surveillance and planning. The fact that they had approached using the old mining road meant they had detailed topographical intelligence and had identified every possible escape route from the town. This wasn't a random law enforcement action or a case of mistaken identity. This was a deliberate, professionally executed operation targeting someone specific, and that someone was her. Rosalie's hands continued their mechanical motion of arranging napkins, but her mind had shifted into a state of hyper-awareness that she hadn't experienced in over a decade. Time seemed to slow as her enhanced perception absorbed every detail of the unfolding situation. The coffee maker's gurgling became unnaturally loud. The tick of the wall clock echoed like a metronome. The familiar sense of the diner coffee, bacon grease, cleaning supplies suddenly seemed overwhelming in their intensity. Through the window, she watched figures emerge from the vehicles with movements that screamed military training. They wore civilian clothes, but their bearing was unmistakably professional. Dark jeans, tactical boots, and loose-fitting jackets that undoubtedly concealed body armor and weapons. Their deployment pattern was textbook perfect, establishing a perimeter, identifying potential threats, securing escape routes, whoever these people were. They were very good at what they did. The lead figure was a tall woman with short blonde hair and the kind of purposeful stride that belonged to someone accustomed to command. She gestured briefly to her team, and they immediately spread out to cover the diner's exits with the fluid coordination of operators who had worked together extensively. 2 took positions near the front entrance, 2 more disappeared around the back to cover the kitchen exit, and the remainder established overwatch positions that commanded clear sight, lines to the entire building. Rosalie's mouth went dry as the implications crashed over her. 15 years of careful invisibility, of meticulously constructed identity, of desperate attempts to bury her past, all of it had been for nothing. They had found her. The organization she had betrayed, the handler she had abandoned, the shadow world she had tried to escape, It had all caught up with her in the most peaceful place she had ever known. Her mind raced through possibilities and calculations with the cold efficiency that had once made her so valuable as an operative. The diner offered limited defensive positions and too many windows for effective cover. The kitchen had a back exit, but they would have that covered. The basement storage area had no external access. The apartment upstairs was a potential fallback position, but ultimately a trap. Every tactical assessment led to the same conclusion. She was surrounded, outgunned, and operating alone in a location chosen for its peaceful isolation rather than its defensive capabilities. But even as her professional training cataloged the hopelessness of her situation, another part of her mind was focused on a more immediate concern. In less than 15 minutes, the morning regulars would begin arriving for their daily coffee and conversation. Harold Brennan would park his pickup truck right outside and shuffle in for his usual black coffee and wheat toast. Old Pete Morrison would claim his corner booth and order the same breakfast he'd been eating for the past 8 years. Young Mrs. Chun from the post office would stop by for her large coffee with extra cream before opening the mail facility. These people had become more than customers over the years. They had become the closest thing to family that Rosalie had allowed herself since disappearing from her old life. They trusted her, relied on the comfort and consistency she provided, had no idea that their friendly neighborhood waitress was actually a trained killer whose past was about to explode into their peaceful world. The thought of these innocent people being caught in whatever was about to unfold made her stomach clench with a fear more intense than anything she had felt during her most dangerous missions. The blonde woman approached the front door with measured steps, her hand resting casually near her waist in a position that would allow instant access to a concealed weapon. Through the glass, Rosalie could see her eyes cold, professional, and completely focused. This was someone who had been hunting her for a very long time. Someone who understood exactly who she was dealing with, and had prepared accordingly. As the woman's hand touched the door handle, Rosalie made a decision that would have been unthinkable during her operative years. Instead of running, instead of fighting, instead of employing any of the escape protocols that had been drilled into her during 3 years of intensive training, she chose to protect the innocent civilians who would soon be walking into what was about to become a war zone. She moved to the coffee pot with deliberate calm, filling a cup with hands that showed no tremor despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She arranged her face into the same pleasant expression she wore every morning, the mask of Rosalie Hendricks, friendly waitress and pillar of the community. When the door chimed and the blonde woman stepped inside, Rosalie looked up with a smile that gave no hint of the deadly calculations running through her mind. "Good morning," she said in the same warm tone she used with every customer. "Coffee?" The woman stopped just inside the doorway, her eyes never leaving Rosalie's face. When she spoke, her voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Catherine Elena Marchetti," she said, each syllable falling into the quiet diner like a hammer blow. "Also known as Agent Nightingale of the Strategic Operations Division. Also known as Rosalie Hendricks, friendly neighborhood waitress." The coffee pot trembled slightly in Rosalie's hand, the first crack in her carefully maintained composure. Hearing her real name spoken aloud after 15 years of careful burial felt like having her skin stripped away layer by layer. But she kept her voice steady as she responded. "I'm sorry, but I think you have me confused with someone else. I'm just Rosalie. I run this diner." The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "My name is Commander Sarah Voss, United States Navy. We need to talk." Outside, Rosalie could see more figures moving into position. Not just the team that had arrived in the SUVs, but additional personnel who had apparently been infiltrating the town over the past several days. The peaceful morning routine of Cedar Falls was about to be shattered forever, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The past had finally caught up with her, and the reckoning she had spent 15 years trying to avoid was about to begin. Moments stretched like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Rosalie's mind fractured into two distinct streams of consciousness. One, desperately clinging to the fiction of the small-town waitress, the other coldly calculating the tactical situation. With the precision of a trained killer. The coffee pot in her hand suddenly felt absurdly domestic, a prop from a play she could no longer pretend to be performing. "Commander Hayes, Naval Special Warfare Command," the man said, producing credentials that looked authentic enough to fool anyone except someone who had once forged similar documents herself. "We need to talk, Catherine. Or do you prefer Agent Nightingale?" The Cody name hit her like a slap. Agent Nightingale had been buried so deeply that hearing it spoken aloud felt like listening to someone read her obituary. Only a handful of people had ever known that designation, and most of them were supposed to be dead or disappeared into the same shadow world she had escaped from. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew the performance was over. Hayes's expression told her that denial was pointless. Whatever intelligence had led them here was comprehensive enough to make protest futile. Through the front window, she watched the tactical team from the 4th SUV spread out with military efficiency. They weren't bothering with subtlety anymore. These were operators in full combat gear, armed with assault rifles and moving with the coordinated precision of a unit that had worked together extensively. One team took position across the street, establishing overwatch positions that would give them clear fields of fire on the diner's exits. Another pair moved toward the rear of the building, cutting off her planned escape route through the kitchen. "Your neighbors seem like nice people," Hayes observed, his tone conversational but his eyes hard as flint. "Mrs. Patterson with her Basset Hound, young Tommy who runs every morning, old Pete Morrison who comes in for pancakes every Tuesday. It would be unfortunate if they got caught in the crossfire." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. They had done their homework, learning not just her location, but the routines of everyone around her. The implication was clear: resistance would endanger the innocent people who had welcomed her into their community. It was a masterful psychological pressure point, leveraging the very connections that had made her life in Cedar Falls meaningful. "What do you want?" she asked, abandoning any pretense of not understanding the situation. "Orders came down 3 days ago," Hayes replied, settling more comfortably onto his stool as if they were having a casual conversation over coffee. "Seems someone high up the food chain has decided that certain former assets need to be brought back into the fold. The geopolitical situation has evolved since your unauthorized departure from the program." Rosalie felt ice forming in her stomach. She had always known this was a possibility, that the organization might someday decide her skills were too valuable to remain in retirement, or that her knowledge of classified operations made her too dangerous to leave unsupervised. But she had hoped that 15 years of invisibility might have convinced them she was no longer a threat. "I'm retired," she said firmly. "I've been out of the game for 15 years. Whatever skills I had are rusty beyond use." Hayes smiled, and the expression was like watching a shark show its teeth. "Funny thing about muscle memory, Catherine. It never really goes away. We've been watching you for the past month. Your morning runs follow tactical reconnaissance patterns. You still automatically assess threat levels on every person who enters this establishment. Even now, you're calculating distances to weapons and exits." He was right, and they both knew it. Even as they spoke, part of her mind was noting that the knife rack was 18 inches to her left, that the rear exit was 37 steps through the kitchen, that the cast iron skillet on the back burner could serve as both weapon and shield. The training was like a virus in her neural pathways, impossible to completely eradicate. "The Prague operation was particularly impressive," Hayes continued, his voice taking on an admiring tone that made her skin crawl. 8 months of deep cover, perfect character maintenance, and a clean termination that looked like a heart attack. The target never suspected the woman he fell in love with was the instrument of his death. That level of emotional compartmentalization is ... rare. The mention of Prague sent a spike of nausea through her system. That operation had been the beginning of the end for Catherine Marchetti, the mission that had finally shown her the true cost of what she had become. The arms dealer had been a genuinely decent man trapped in an indecent business, trying to find a way out when she had been ordered to ensure he never got the chance. "That was a long time ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not so long that you've forgotten how to do it," Hayes replied. "In fact, we have it on good authority that you've maintained your physical conditioning and combat readiness despite your sabbatical. The question is whether you're going to come with us voluntarily, or whether we need to make this unpleasant for everyone involved." Outside, more vehicles were arriving. She could see additional tactical units taking positions throughout the town, their black uniforms and military bearing creating in surreal contrast with the peaceful mountain setting. They weren't just prepared to extract her, they were prepared for a small war. "You're scaring the civilians," she observed, watching through the window as Mrs. Patterson hurried past with her dog, clearly alarmed by the sudden military presence. "That's unfortunate but unavoidable," Hayes said with a shrug. "We tried the subtle approach first. Surveillance, background investigation, confirmation of identity. But orders are orders, and time is apparently of the essence. There's a situation developing overseas that requires your particular skill set." The scope of the operation was becoming clear. This wasn't a small extraction team sent to quietly retrieve a former asset. This was a full military operation designed to overwhelm any possible resistance and ensure mission success regardless of collateral damage. The number of operators, the heavy equipment, the coordinated positioning, it all spoke to a level of resources that meant someone very important wanted her back very badly. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Hayes's expression hardened. "Then we extract you anyway. The only difference is how much of Cedar Falls gets damaged in the process. Your choice, Catherine. Come quietly, and your friends here continue their peaceful lives. Make this difficult, and we do whatever is necessary to complete our mission." The ultimatum hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. 15 years of careful construction, 15 years of building relationships and creating a life worth living, and it could all be destroyed in the next few minutes. The people who had welcomed Rosalie Hendricks into their community had no idea they were about to pay the price for Catherine Marchetti's past. Through the kitchen pass-through, she could see movement in the alley behind the building. More tactical operators, positioned to prevent any escape attempt through the rear exit. The building was completely surrounded, the town itself under what amounted to military occupation. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. Hayes checked his watch with deliberate precision. "The operation timeline calls for extraction to be completed within the next 10 minutes. After that, we move to secondary protocols, which are significantly less ... diplomatic. 10 minutes. 10 minutes to abandon everything she had built, everyone she had come to care about, and return to a world she had spent 15 years trying to forget. 10 minutes to decide whether Rosalie Hendricks would disappear forever, leaving only the ghost of Catherine Marchetti to walk back into the shadows. But as she looked out at the tactical teams, positioning themselves throughout her adopted hometown, as she thought about the innocent people who would suffer if this situation escalated, she realized the choice had already been made. Catherine Marchetti had destroyed enough lives. She wouldn't let Rosalie Hendricks's friends pay for her past sins. "I need to get my coat from the back room," she said quietly. Hayes nodded approvingly. "Smart choice, but Catherine, don't mistake our politeness for weakness. Any attempt to run, to fight, or to alert anyone, and those 10 minutes become 10 seconds. Are we clear?" She met his eyes directly, letting him see just a glimpse of the cold calculation that had once made Agent Nightingale so effective. "Crystal clear, Commander. But understand this, I'm coming with you to protect these people, not because I'm afraid of you or your team." "Noted," Hayes replied, though his hand had moved fractionally closer to his concealed weapon. "The car is waiting outside. Time to go home, Catherine." As she moved toward the kitchen, Rosalie Hendricks began to die, and Catherine Marchetti, Agent Nightingale, began her unwilling resurrection. The kitchen felt like a tomb as Rosalie pushed through the swinging door, her mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with surrender. Hayes might believe he had cornered a retired asset ready to comply, but he had made one critical miscalculation. He had threatened the people she had come to love. That transformed this from a simple extraction into something far more dangerous than her. Coat hung on a peg near the back door, exactly where she had told Hayes it would be. But her real objective was the loose floorboard beneath the prep counter, the one that concealed an emergency cache she had prayed she would never need to access. Her fingers found the hidden catches with muscle memory that 15 years hadn't dulled, and the board lifted silently to reveal a waterproof container. Inside lay the tools of her former trade: a ceramic knife that would pass through any metal detector, a small quantity of plastic explosive with remote detonators, 3 different sets of false identification documents, and a compact 9mm pistol with 2 spare magazines. Everything had been wrapped in protective material and sealed against moisture, preserved like artifacts from a life she had tried to forget. The ceramic knife felt alien and familiar in her hand simultaneously. Its weight was perfectly balanced, its edge honed to surgical sharpness. She had carried identical weapons on a dozen operations, relying on their undetectable nature to get her close to targets who thought they were protected by conventional security measures. Now it would serve a different purpose, ensuring that Cedar Falls didn't become a casualty of her past. Through the kitchen's small window, she could see 2 operators positioned in the alley, their attention focused on the rear exit. They were professionals, but they were thinking like hunters pursuing prey, not soldiers facing an equal adversary. Their positioning revealed their assumption that she would either surrender meekly or attempt a panicked escape. They weren't prepared for someone who would fight back with lethal efficiency. The first operator never saw her coming. She moved through the back door like a shadow, the ceramic blade finding the gap between his tactical vest and helmet with precision born of years of training. He dropped without a sound, his finger never reaching his radio. The second man turned at the soft rustle of his partner's collapse, but Catherine was already inside his guard, one hand covering his mouth while the blade found his throat. 2 down. No alarms raised. The tactical situation had shifted, but only marginally. She stripped the first operator of his radio and earpiece, listening to the calm chatter of a team that still believed they had complete control of the situation. Hayes's voice came through clearly, requesting status updates from various positions. She now had intelligence on their deployment: 6 operators surrounding the building, 4 more positioned as overwatch, and Hayes himself maintaining overwatch from inside the diner. The radio traffic also revealed something crucial. They weren't just here for extraction. Fragments of conversation mentioned termination authorization and clean slate protocols. Someone had decided that Catherine Marchetti knew too much to be allowed to live, regardless of whether she agreed to return to active service. This was an elimination mission disguised as recruitment that changed everything, moving with the fluid silence that had once made her legendary among her peers. Catherine began systematically eliminating the tactical team. The third operator fell to a thrown knife that caught him in the throat as he rounded the corner of the building. The fourth died when she used his own sidearm against him, turning his moment of recognition into his last conscious thought. She was no longer the frightened waitress Hayes thought he was extracting. Agent Nightingale had awakened fully, and 15 years of suppressed training flooded back like muscle memory, reclaiming its dominance. Every movement was calculated, every strike lethal, every decision made with the cold efficiency that had once made her the most feared operative in the Strategic Operations Division. The Overwatch team proved more challenging. Positioned on rooftops and in second-story windows, they had clear fields of fire and good communication with each other. But Catherine had advantages they couldn't anticipate: intimate knowledge of Cedar Falls layout and the tactical patience to wait for the right moments to strike. She used the town's familiar geography against them, moving through buildings she knew by heart, exploiting blind spots and dead angles that only a long-term resident would recognize. The general store's rear loading dock provided concealment for her approach to the first sniper position. The second fell when she emerged from the storm drains that ran beneath Main Street infrastructure she had mapped during her early months in town as part of her escape planning. By the time Hayes realized, his team was being systematically eliminated. Half his operators were dead, and Catherine had disappeared into the maze of alleys and buildings she knew better than anyone. His calm professionalism cracked as reports of no contact and position compromised flooded the radio frequencies. "Catherine." His voice echoed through the diner's window speakers as he activated the vehicle's external communication system. "This isn't necessary. We can negotiate." But Catherine was done negotiating. Done pretending. Done allowing others to threaten the life she had built. The gentle waitress Rosalie Hendricks had died the moment Hayes threatened her friends, and what remained was the deadly operative who had once eliminated targets across 3 continents. Without ever failing a mission, she materialized in the diner's kitchen like a ghost, moving through the space she knew intimately while Hayes remained focused on the street outside. The ceramic knife was back in her hand, its edge gleaming in the morning light. 15 years of coffee service and friendly conversation had ended. Agent Nightingale was home. Hayes spun as she entered the dining area, his weapon clearing its holster with practiced speed. But Catherine had anticipated the move, had counted on his training to make him predictable. She was already moving, already inside his guard, the knife describing a precise arc toward his throat. He managed to deflect the blade with his forearm, the ceramic edge slicing through his jacket and drawing blood, but missing the killing stroke by inches. They crashed into the counter, sending coffee cups and plates cascading to the floor in a shower of ceramic and glass. Hayes was bigger, stronger, and 15 years younger, but Catherine had advantages that training couldn't provide: desperation, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and the cold fury of someone protecting everything she held dear. They fought with lethal intensity among the ruins of her peaceful morning routine. Tables overturned, windows shattered, the cheerful red vinyl, booth cushions slashed and bleeding stuffing. This was combat at its most personal and vicious. 2 professionals locked in a death struggle that could only end with one of them lying still on the checkered linoleum floor. Hayes landed a devastating blow to her ribs that sent her crashing into the pie display case, glass exploding around her. But Catherine rolled with the impact, came up with a shard of mirror in each hand, and launched herself back into the fight with renewed ferocity. The end came suddenly. Hayes overextended on a punch intended to finish her, and Catherine stepped inside his guard one final time. The ceramic knife found the gap between his body armor plates, sliding between his ribs with the whisper-quiet efficiency of a blade designed for silence. He looked down at the growing stain on his shirt with something approaching admiration. "Should have brought more men," he gasped. "Should have left me alone," Catherine replied, lowering his body gently to the floor. The radio crackled with urgent transmissions as the surviving team members realized their commander was down. But their numbers were too depleted for another assault, and their intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. They had come expecting to collect a retired asset. Instead, They had awakened something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. Standing among the wreckage of Millie's diner, surrounded by the debris of the peaceful life she had built, Catherine Marchetti faced a terrible truth. Agent Nightingale had never really died. She had just been sleeping, waiting for the right threat to call her back to life. The question now was whether Rosalie Hendricks could ever exist again, or if the violence had finally claimed what remained of the woman who had once dreamed of nothing more than serving coffee and living in peace. In the terrible silence that followed the violence, Catherine stood motionless among the wreckage of what had been her sanctuary. The ceramic knife hung loose in her bloodied fingers, its purpose fulfilled, but its presence now feeling obscene in the space where she had once served coffee and listened to stories about grandchildren and fishing trips. Broken glass crunched under her feet as she turned slowly, taking in the devastation that 15 minutes of combat had wrought upon 15 years of careful construction. The diner looked like a war zone. Tables lay overturned, their chrome legs twisted at unnatural angles. The red vinyl booths were slashed open, their stuffing scattered across the floor like snow. The large front windows had spider-webbed from the impact of Hayes's body being thrown against them, and morning sunlight streamed through the cracks and fractured patterns that painted everything in sharp, broken lines. The smell of spilled coffee mixed with something metallic and organic that she recognized from a dozen other scenes of violence. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the fight beginning to ebb and leave behind. A tremor that seemed to emanate from her very bones. She looked down at herself and saw blood, some of it Hayes's, some from the other operators, and some her own from where glass had found its way through her defenses. The simple blue uniform dress that had been Rosalie Hendricks's armor against the world was torn and stained beyond recognition. Through the shattered windows, she could see the surviving members of the tactical team maintaining their positions, but no longer advancing. Their radio chatter, still audible through Hayes's dropped earpiece, revealed confusion and uncertainty. The operation had gone catastrophically wrong, and they were waiting for new orders from a command structure that might not even know yet that their primary team had been eliminated. Catherine forced herself to move, stepping carefully around Hayes's body toward the front of the diner. Her reflection in the cracked mirror behind the counter stopped her cold. The woman looking back at her was a stranger wearing Rosalie's face, hollow-eyed, blood-streaked, and radiating the kind of controlled violence that made ordinary people instinctively step back. This was not the gentle waitress who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of invisibility. This was Agent Nightingale, fully awakened and impossibly dangerous. The radio crackled with a new voice, older and more authoritative than Hayes had been. "Catherine Marchetti, this is Colonel Morrison, Joint Special Operations Command. I'm assuming primary command of this operation." She picked up the earpiece with fingers that had finally stopped trembling. "Hello, Colonel. I'm afraid Commander Hayes is no longer available to take your call." A pause then. "We're prepared to discuss terms, Catherine. This situation has escalated beyond our initial parameters." "Has it?" She laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You sent a death squad to my home, threatened innocent civilians, and destroyed my life. What exactly did you think was going to happen? Our intelligence suggested you had been fully domesticated by your retirement. We underestimated your continued capabilities." The clinical language made her want to scream. Domesticated, as if 15 years of choosing peace over violence, of building genuine relationships and finding meaning in simple human connections, had been some kind of weakness rather than the hardest thing she had ever accomplished. "Your intelligence was flawed," she said simply. Through the window, she could see townspeople beginning to emerge from their homes and businesses, drawn by the sounds of combat and the presence of military vehicles. Mrs. Patterson stood on her front porch, still in her bathrobe, clutching her basset hound and staring at the diner with undisguised horror. Tommy Valdez had stopped his morning run and was talking urgently into his cell phone, probably calling the sheriff. Old Pete Morrison was making his way slowly down Main Street, his usual Tuesday pancake breakfast forgotten in the face of what looked like an invasion. These people had known her as Rosalie. They had trusted her, welcomed her, treated her like family. Now they were seeing something that would fundamentally change how they understood the world around them. The safe, predictable rhythms of Cedar Falls had been shattered by the revelation that the friendly waitress they had known for 15 years was capable of killing trained soldiers with her bare hands. "We have the town surrounded, Catherine," Morrison continued. "There's no escape from this situation. But we're prepared to be reasonable. Surrender now, and we'll ensure no further harm comes to the civilians. Like you ensured no harm would come to them when you sent Hayes and his team. That operation was conducted under different parameters. We're prepared to negotiate." The word negotiate hung in the air like a bitter joke. She had tried negotiating 15 years ago when she decided to disappear from the program. The response had been a kill team sent to eliminate her before she could fully extract herself. She had survived that attempt only through a combination of superior planning and pure luck. Now, apparently, they had decided to try recruitment instead of assassination. But the underlying message was the same. Her freedom existed only at their discretion. Catherine moved to the front window, making herself visible to the townspeople gathering in the street. She wanted them to see her, to understand that their Rosalie was gone and might never come back. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her mouth when she caught sight of the blood and the hollow look in Catherine's eyes. Tommy took an involuntary step backward, his phone forgotten in his hand. "You want to negotiate?" Catherine said into the radio. "Here are my terms. You withdraw your teams immediately. You leave Cedar Falls and never come back. You declare Catherine Marchetti officially dead and bury all records of this operation so deep they never see daylight again. You know that's not possible. Then we don't have anything to discuss." She pulled the earpiece from her ear and crushed it under her heel, ending the conversation with the same finality that had ended Hayes's life. The silence that followed felt even more oppressive than the sounds of combat had been. Moving behind the counter, Catherine began methodically destroying anything that might be used to identify her or track her movements. She pulled the hard drive from the diner's ancient computer system and smashed it with a coffee pot. She gathered every piece of identification, every document, every photograph that connected her to Rosalie Hendricks and fed them into the gas flame of the kitchen stove. Watching her carefully constructed identity burn, she felt something inside her break that might never heal. Rosalie Hendricks had been more than a cover identity. She had been a genuine attempt at redemption, a chance to prove that someone who had done terrible things could change and find a different way to live. Now that possibility was turning to ash in her fingers. The sound of helicopter rotors began to echo off the mountains, growing steadily louder. More personnel incoming, or perhaps an evacuation for the surviving team members. Either way, it meant her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Catherine looked one last time at the ruins of Millie's diner, at the place where she had been happier than any other time in her adult life. The checkered linoleum was stained with blood that would never wash clean. The coffee maker she had used every morning for 15 years lay broken among the debris. The photographs on the walls, all those images of Cedar Falls in its mining heyday, when the town had been full of hope and possibility, were scattered and torn. She had saved the town from becoming a battlefield, but she had destroyed everything that had made it feel like home. The people she had come to love would never look at her the same way again. Rosalie Hendricks was dead, killed not by Hayes's team, but by the necessity of becoming Catherine Marchetti again. The woman who walked out the back door of the diner was neither the peaceful waitress who had entered that morning, nor the cold operative who had once terrorized half the world. She was something new and uncertain, carrying the memories of both lives and the skills of a killer, but lacking any clear sense of who she was supposed to be now. Behind her, Cedar Falls began the process of trying to understand what had happened. In their quiet mountain town, while ahead lay a future that stretched out like an unmapped wilderness, full of dangers she could anticipate and possibilities she could never have imagined, Catherine had made it exactly 3 miles into the mountain wilderness when she heard the distinctive whine of military drones overhead. She pressed herself against a granite outcropping, using the rock formation to mask her heat signature while she evaluated her situation. The terrain was familiar. She had run these trails countless times over the past 15 years, but familiarity wouldn't help her against thermal imaging and satellite surveillance. The sound of approaching helicopters grew steadily louder, but something was wrong with the audio signature. These weren't the heavy transport choppers Morrison's people had been using. These were lighter, faster, with the distinctive rotor signature of military scout aircraft. More concerning was the fact that they seemed to be coming from the wrong direction entirely. Her stolen radio, taken from one of Hayes's fallen operators, crackled to life with transmissions in a frequency she didn't recognize. The voices were American, but they weren't using the call signs or protocols she had been monitoring from Morrison's team. Instead, she heard code words that made her blood freeze. Nightingale located. Guardian Angel inbound, and most impossibly, Sanctuary protocols active. Sanctuary protocols. Catherine's mind reeled. Those were words from a program that had been classified above her clearance level, even during her operational years. Whispered rumors of a fail-safe system designed to protect assets who had been burned or compromised. She had always assumed it was mythology, a comforting fiction that operators told themselves to believe someone would come if everything went wrong. But the helicopters were real, and they were definitely not Morrison's, the first aircraft to appear. Over the ridge was a sleek black helicopter she didn't recognize, moving with the aggressive efficiency of a gunship but bearing no military markings. It swept over her position without slowing, then banked sharply toward the town below where Morrison's remaining forces were regrouping. Catherine watched through binoculars she had retrieved from her emergency cache as the unmarked aircraft descended toward the tactical teams positioned around Cedar Falls. What happened next defied everything she thought she knew about the situation. The helicopter didn't land. Instead, it began broadcasting on loudspeakers, the voice carrying clearly across the mountain valley. By order of the Department of Defense Inspector General, all personnel will stand down immediately. This operation has been terminated. Repeat. Stand down and prepare for debriefing. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio frequencies, confusion evident even through the static. Guardian Angel, this is Overlord Actual. We have no record of Inspector General involvement in this operation. Please authenticate. Overlord Actual, authentication is Tango 77 Alpha Bravo Charlie. Operation Nightfall is hereby terminated under National Security Directive 51. All personnel will disarm and prepare for extraction. Catherine felt the world shift beneath her feet. She knew those authentication codes, had memorized them during her training 15 years ago as part of emergency protocols she had never expected to use. But more importantly, she recognized the voice on the loudspeaker. It was older, rougher than she remembered, but unmistakably familiar. Director James Caldwell, the man who had recruited her into the Strategic Operations Division, the man who had trained her, shaped her into Agent Nightingale, and then disappeared into the classified maze of government black projects when she had extracted herself from the program. She had assumed he was dead, or at minimum, retired to some anonymous existence like her own. Apparently, she had been wrong. The radio chatter that followed painted a picture of complete chaos in Morrison's command structure. Orders and counter-orders flew back and forth as different levels of authority tried to establish control of the situation. But the authentication codes Caldwell had provided were apparently genuine and carried enough weight to force Morrison's people into compliance. Catherine watched as the tactical teams around Cedar Falls began withdrawing to their vehicles. There, weapons lowered, their body language suggesting confusion rather than hostility. The siege of her adopted hometown was ending as abruptly as it had begun, but she couldn't understand why or what it meant for her future. Her stolen radio buzzed with a new transmission, this one on a frequency she hadn't heard used since her operational days. "Nightingale, this is Guardian Angel. Please respond on this channel." For long moments, Catherine stared at the radio without moving. Responding would reveal her position and confirm her identity to whoever was really behind this intervention. But remaining silent might mean missing the only chance she would get to understand what was happening. "Guardian Angel, this is Nightingale," she finally transmitted. "I'm listening." "Catherine." Caldwell's voice came through with surprising clarity, stripped of the official authority he had been projecting over the loudspeakers. "I'm sorry it took us so long to respond. Are you injured?" The question was so unexpected, so genuinely concerned, that it took her several seconds to formulate a reply. "Physically intact. Confused as hell. What's happening, James?" "What's happening is that you just prevented a major international incident through your actions this morning. The team that came after you wasn't operating under official sanction. Morrison went rogue 3 months ago and has been using classified resources to pursue a personal agenda." Catherine's mind struggled to process this information. "Personal agenda? Your Prague operation 15 years ago. The arms dealer you eliminated. His brother spent the last decade building a private military corporation and getting very rich, selling weapons to unfriendly governments. He hired Morrison to settle the family debt by bringing you in for a very unpleasant conversation. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Marcus Volkov, the arms dealer's younger brother, who had been studying engineering in Moscow when she had killed his sibling. She had read his file during her mission preparation, but had assessed him as a non-threat, too young and too removed from the family business to pose any future danger. "You're telling me this was revenge? Personal revenge? With a lot of classified government resources being used to make it happen. Morrison convinced his superiors that you represented an ongoing security risk and needed to be brought in for debriefing. What he didn't tell them was that he was being paid 7 figures to deliver you to Volkov personally." The helicopter was circling lower now, and Catherine could see repelling equipment being prepared. But instead of tactical gear, the figures visible in the aircraft were wearing civilian clothes and appeared to be unarmed. "The sanctuary protocols," she said, understanding beginning to dawn. "You've been watching me all this time." "Not watching. Protecting. The Strategic Operations Division might have officially disbanded, but we never stopped caring about our people, especially the ones who tried to find better ways to live." Caldwell's voice carried a note of something that might have been pride or possibly regret. "You did good work in Cedar Falls, Catherine. Better work than you ever did for us. Building relationships, becoming part of a community, proving that people can change. That's worth protecting. And now you have choices. Real choices for probably the first time in your adult life. Morrison's operation is blown, his funding is cut off, and Volkov is about to discover that hiring rogue military officers to settle personal vendettas is a very expensive mistake. You're officially off everyone's target list." The helicopter was touching down now, 50 yards from her position. She could see Caldwell in the passenger seat, older and grayer than she remembered, but unmistakably the man who had shaped her into one of the world's most effective killers, and then, apparently, spent 15 years trying to help her find a way back to being human. "The people in Cedar Falls," she said. "What about them?" "They're going to be told that this was a training exercise that went wrong. Compensation will be provided for damages, official apologies will be made, and the whole incident will disappear into classified files that will never see daylight. Your secret is safe." Catherine looked back toward the town, barely visible through the trees, but still precious to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The life she had built as Rosalie Hendricks was over, but perhaps something new could be constructed from the ruins, and Catherine Marchetti, she asked, can disappear forever if that's what you want. Or she can find new ways to use her skills for better purposes. We have some interesting projects that could use someone with your particular combination of abilities and moral evolution. For the first time in hours, Catherine felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. The choice between running and hiding or returning to government service wasn't the only option available. There might be a third path, one that honored both the deadly skills she couldn't fully abandon and the peaceful connection she had learned to value. Walking toward the helicopter, Catherine Marchetti began to imagine what Agent Nightingale might become if she chose to fly toward the light, instead of hiding in the shadows. The helicopter's interior was unlike anything Catherine had expected. Instead of military seating and tactical equipment, it had been configured as a mobile command center with comfortable leather chairs, communications equipment, and what appeared to be a small conference area. Caldwell gestured for her to take the seat across from him as the aircraft lifted off from the mountain clearing. 15 years, he said, studying her face with the intensity of someone trying to reconcile memory with reality. You look different, softer somehow, but your eyes ... He paused, searching for the right words. Your eyes look more alive than they ever did during your operational years. Catherine settled into the chair, acutely aware of the blood still staining her torn uniform and the ceramic knife still tucked into her waistband. I had a good life in Cedar Falls, past tense apparently. Not necessarily past tense, Caldwell replied, opening a leather portfolio that contained what appeared to be official documentation. Before we discuss your future, I need to show you something that will help you understand just how significant this morning's events really were. He handed her a thick file marked with classification stamps she didn't recognize. The cover sheet bore her photograph, not the recent surveillance images she would have expected, but a formal portrait that looked like it belonged in some kind of official gallery. What is this? Your commendation file. Compiled over the past 5 years as part of a comprehensive review of former Strategic Operations Division personnel. Caldwell's voice carried a note of formal pride that reminded her of award ceremonies she had never been invited to attend. Catherine, what you did in Prague wasn't just another elimination mission. Viktor Petrov, the arms dealer you terminated, was 3 days away from closing a deal that would have put military-grade weapons in the hands of 6 different terrorist organizations. She opened the file, seeing intelligence reports and analysis. Documents that painted a very different picture of her final operation than the one she had carried in her memory. Instead of eliminating a man trying to escape his criminal past, she had apparently prevented what analysts estimated could have been thousands of civilian casualties across multiple continents. The ripple effects of that single operation continued. For years, Caldwell continued. The weapons network collapsed without Petrov's connections. 3 separate terrorist plots were abandoned when their planned armaments became unavailable. Conservative estimates suggest you saved more lives with that one mission than most operatives save in their entire careers. Catherine stared at the documents, trying to reconcile this information with her memory of a decent man who had spoken lovingly about opening a small restaurant and leaving his dark past behind. He seemed genuinely reformed. I thought I was killing someone who was trying to change. He was trying to change. But he was also trying to complete one final transaction that would have funded his retirement with blood money. People are complicated, Catherine. Even the ones we eliminate for valid reasons. The file contained more surprises. Photographs of terrorist attacks that had been prevented, weapon seizures that had been made possible by intelligence gathered during her Prague operation, and a detailed analysis of how the disruption of Petrov's network had contributed to regional stability across Eastern Europe. "This is why you've been protecting me?" she asked. "Partially. But more importantly, it's why what happened in Cedar Falls this morning matters to people at the highest levels of government." Caldwell reached for another document, this one bearing the seal of the Secretary of Defense. At 0800 hours today, Marcus Volkov's private military corporation was conducting what they believed would be a simple extraction of a former American intelligence asset for purposes of interrogation and elimination. Catherine felt ice forming in her stomach. Interrogation. About what? Everything you knew about his brother's operation. Client lists, financial networks, weapons caches, operational protocols. Information that would have allowed Volkov to rebuild his brother's empire with the added advantage of knowing exactly how American intelligence had penetrated it the first time. The implications were staggering. If Morrison's team had successfully extracted her, if Volkov had gotten the intelligence he was seeking, the carefully dismantled weapons network could have been rebuilt with safeguards against American penetration. The terrorist organizations that had been neutralized 15 years ago could have been rearmed and operational within months. Instead, Caldwell continued, they encountered something they never expected, a former operative who had found reasons to fight that were stronger than any training we ever gave her. You didn't just defend yourself this morning, Catherine. You protected classified intelligence that could have destabilized 3 regions if it had fallen into the wrong hands. He handed her a third document, this one bearing multiple official seals and signatures. It was a presidential commendation, formally recognizing her actions in Cedar Falls and acknowledging her service to national security. The language was carefully crafted to reveal nothing classified, while making it clear that her contributions had been both significant and ongoing. Ongoing? She asked, noting the present tense in several of the paragraphs. The sanctuary protocols weren't just about protection, Catherine. They were about observation and assessment. For 15 years, we've been watching how you used the skills we gave you in a civilian context. Teaching you to kill was easy. Learning from how you chose to live, that's been invaluable. Through the helicopter's windows, she could see they were flying over Cedar Falls. The town looked deceptively peaceful from this altitude, with no visible signs of the morning's violence. Morrison's vehicles were gone, and life appeared to be returning to its normal rhythms. But she knew that the people below would never see their quiet mountain community quite the same way again. The diner, she said. The damage to the town. The people who saw what happened. Being handled as we speak, Caldwell assured her. The cover story is that this was a training exercise that went wrong when live ammunition was accidentally substituted for blanks. Embarrassing for the military, but not the kind of thing that generates lasting questions. Insurance will cover all damages, and there will be some very generous settlement payments to ensure people remember this as an unfortunate accident rather than something more sinister. And Rosalie Hendricks can remain officially dead if that's what you prefer. Or she can be given a new backstory that explains her temporary absence and allows her to return to Cedar Falls with a clean slate. The choice is yours. Catherine looked down at the town that had been her home, thinking of Mrs. Patterson and her basset hound, of Tommy Valdez training for cross-country championships, of old Pete Morrison, who would be expecting his Tuesday pancakes. They had welcomed Rosalie Hendricks into their community without question, trusted her with their stories and their friendship. What about the people who saw me fight? Who saw what I'm capable of? They saw a woman defending her home against what appeared to be dangerous criminals, Caldwell replied. Self-defense is admirable, not suspicious. The official story will be that you had some military training in your past, enough to explain your effectiveness without requiring deeper investigation. He leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. But Catherine, there's something else you need to consider. The skills you demonstrated this morning. The way you adapted 15-year-old training to a modern tactical situation. The moral clarity you showed in choosing to fight rather than surrender. Those capabilities are exactly what we need for a new kind of operation. I'm done being an assassin, she said firmly. I'm not talking about assassination. I'm talking about protection. There are other former operatives out there, people who tried to build new lives like you did, but who don't have the benefit of sanctuary protocols. Some of them are being hunted by enemies they made during their service years. Some are being recruited by organizations that want to use their skills for profit rather than principle. Caldwell opened his portfolio again, revealing photographs of people she didn't recognize, but whose eyes carried the same haunted quality she had seen in her own mirror for years. We want to offer them what we offered you, a chance to use their lethal skills for protective rather than destructive purposes, to be guardians instead of predators, to find meaning in preserving life rather than taking it. Catherine studied the photographs, seeing herself reflected in their faces. And you want me to lead this program? I want you to design it. You've lived both sides of this equation, the killer and the protector, the hunter and the guardian. You know better than anyone what it takes to transform someone trained for violence into someone capable of genuine peace. The helicopter was beginning its descent toward a landing area that looked like it belonged to a private airfield. Catherine could see other aircraft on the ground, some military, some civilian, all suggesting an operation of considerable scope and resources. The Rosalie Hendricks who served coffee and listened to stories about grandchildren, Caldwell said as they prepared to land. She wasn't a fiction you created to hide from your past. She was a preview of who Catherine Marchetti could become, if she chose to build something better than what she left behind. As the helicopter touched down, Catherine realized that for the first time in her adult life, she was being offered choices that weren't binary. She didn't have to choose between being a killer and being a victim, between isolation and exposure, between her past and her future. She could choose to become something entirely new, someone who used the capacity for violence to protect rather than destroy, who channeled the strategic mind of an operative toward creating safety rather than eliminating threats, who honored both the deadly skills she couldn't abandon and the peaceful connections she had learned to cherish. Walking toward the building that would house her debriefing, Catherine Marchetti began to envision what Agent Nightingale might accomplish if she chose to guard the light instead of hunting in the darkness. 6 months later, Catherine stood in the doorway of the newly rebuilt Millie's diner, watching the morning sun cast familiar golden patterns across the freshly installed checkered linoleum. The reconstruction had been meticulous, every detail restored to match her memories, but with subtle improvements that spoke of government resources carefully deployed. The new windows were bulletproof glass disguised as ordinary panes. The kitchen had been redesigned with sightlines that would make tactical assessment easier. Even the coffee maker was an upgrade, though it looked identical to the one that had been destroyed in the firefight. The brass plaque mounted beside the front door was small and understated, reading simply, Millie's Diner, rebuilt 2024, in honor of community resilience. Only Catherine knew that it also marked the headquarters of the Guardian Angel program, a classified initiative that provided protection and transition services for former intelligence operatives seeking to build new lives. "Coffee's ready," called a voice from behind the counter. Elena Vasquez emerged from the kitchen, her movements carrying the fluid precision that marked her as another graduate of the same shadowy training programs that had shaped Catherine. 6 months ago, Elena had been Elena Santos, a former CIA operative being hunted by a cartel whose leadership she had helped dismantle during her service years. Now she was the co-manager of a mountain diner and the tactical coordinator for an operation that had already successfully relocated 17 former operatives to safe, productive civilian lives. "How are the morning regulars adjusting?" Catherine asked, accepting the steaming mug Elena offered. Better than expected. Mrs. Patterson still brings her dog by every morning, though she's a little more observant now. Tommy Valdez asks more questions about our military consulting business, but he's still training for state championships. And Pete Morrison ... double quote Elena smiled. Pete Morrison ordered extra pancakes yesterday because he said we look like we could use some meat on our bones. The transition back to Cedar Falls had been more complex than Catherine had anticipated. The official story that she had been temporarily relocated for her safety during the investigation of the training accident had been accepted with the kind of gracious discretion that small mountain communities specialized in. People asked enough questions to show they cared, but not so many as to seem intrusive. What had surprised her was how readily the townspeople had embraced the subtle changes in her persona. The Rosalie who had returned was more confident, more alert, more obviously capable of handling herself in dangerous situations. Instead of being alarmed by these changes, the community seemed proud of her transformation, as if they had always known there was something special about their quiet waitress and were pleased to see her potential being recognized. The bell above the front door chimed, and Harold Brennan entered with his usual early morning shuffle. His weathered face broke into a genuine smile when he saw Catherine behind the counter. "Morning, Rosie," he said, settling onto his usual stool. "How's the consulting business treating you?" The cover story they had developed was that Catherine and Elena ran a small security consulting firm that helped rural communities improve their emergency preparedness. It explained their occasional trips to other towns, their sophisticated communication equipment, and the steady stream of visitors who came to Cedar Falls for what were described as training seminars. "Can't complain, Harold," Catherine replied, pouring his usual black coffee. "We've got a new client coming in next week. Former military lady who wants to open a bookstore in Colorado. Needs some advice on small-town business security." It wasn't entirely a lie. The client was indeed a former military operative, Army intelligence specialist, whose cover had been blown during an operation in Afghanistan. The Guardian Angel program would help her establish a legitimate business and a secure identity, while providing ongoing protection until the threats against her were neutralized. "That's good work you're doing," Harold said, adding sugar to his coffee with the deliberate precision of someone performing a familiar ritual. "Helping folks get back on their feet. Takes special people to do that kind of thing." Catherine felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the morning coffee. This was what she had been searching for during all those years of trying to bury Catherine Marchetti and become someone else entirely. Not the complete abandonment of her lethal skills, but their transformation into something that built rather than destroyed, that protected rather than eliminated, that honored the connections between people rather than severing them. Through the front windows, she could see the subtle signs of the security infrastructure that now protected Cedar Falls. The unmarked vehicles parked strategically around town contained Guardian operatives who rotated through on monthly assignments. The communication arrays disguised as cell towers provided encrypted contact with a network of safe houses and support personnel across 3 states. The helicopter landing pad hidden in the forest behind the diner allowed for rapid extraction or reinforcement if threats materialized, but none of those measures were what truly protected this place. What protected Cedar Falls was the community itself, the web of relationships and mutual care that made every resident invested in watching out for their neighbors. Catherine had learned that the strongest security didn't come from weapons or surveillance, but from people who cared enough about each other to pay attention and act when something seemed wrong. "Elena," she called toward the kitchen. "Has Director Caldwell confirmed his arrival time for the quarterly review?" 3 o'clock. "This afternoon," Elena replied. "He's bringing the final authorization for the Montana expansion. Looks like we're going to get approval for 3 more safe house locations." The Guardian Angel program had exceeded everyone's expectations during its first 6 months of operation. What had started as an experimental initiative to protect a handful of former operatives had evolved into a comprehensive network that provided everything from identity services to psychological counseling to job placement assistance. Most importantly, it had proven that people trained for violence could be successfully retrained for protection and community building. Catherine's role in the program had evolved as well. She was no longer just a client receiving protection, but the architect of a new model for post-service transition that honored both the valuable skills operatives possessed and their need to find meaning in peaceful pursuits. Her days were spent designing training curricula, evaluating potential clients, and coordinating with law enforcement agencies that had learned to trust the Guardian Angels as allies rather than threats. The work was challenging in ways that her old missions had never been. Instead of eliminating problems, she had to solve them. Instead of working alone, she had to build and maintain teams. Instead of completing assignments and moving on, she had to invest in long-term relationships and sustainable solutions. But it was also more rewarding than anything she had ever experienced. Each former operative who successfully transitioned to civilian life, each threat neutralized through negotiation rather than violence, each community that accepted a guardian angel as a neighbor and friend, all of it felt like a validation of the choice she had made 15 years ago to try to become someone better than what her training had created. You know what I realized? Alina said, joining her at the counter as the morning rush began to build. We're still in the business of saving lives. We're just doing it by helping people live instead of making sure they die. Catherine nodded, watching Pete Morrison make his way slowly down Main Street toward his usual Tuesday breakfast. In a few minutes, she would serve him pancakes and listen to his stories about his grandchildren. Tonight, she would review intelligence reports and coordinate security for operatives across the country who were trying to build lives as normal and peaceful as Pete's. The woman who had once been Agent Nightingale had finally found a way to honor both sides of her nature. She could be deadly when protection required it, gentle when compassion demanded it, and strategic when building something better than what had existed before. Outside, Cedar Falls awakened to another peaceful morning, unaware that their quiet mountain town had become the heart of a network that was quietly making the world a safer place, one former killer at a time. And inside the diner, Catherine Marchetti poured coffee and planned operations with equal skill, finally understanding that her greatest mission had always been learning how to come home. The bell chimed again as more customers arrived, and Catherine smiled as she reached for the coffee pot. Some secrets, she had learned, were worth keeping. Others were worth transforming into something that served the light instead of hiding from it. After all these years, Agent Nightingale had finally learned to sing a different song. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.